This is a big one. I got into this and I almost didn't find my way out. Lots to talk about tonight. So let's get going. For 1,000 years in Western culture, the advancement of the mechanical arts technology has been inspired by deep religious desires of transcendence and redemption. Although currently obscured by secular language and ideology, the contemporary resurgence of religion, even fundamentalism, alongside and hand in hand with technology, is thus not an aberration, but simply the reassertion of a forgotten tradition. If you don't recognize and understand how religious and technological transcendence have developed together, you'll never be able to successfully counter them, much less recognize when they might be developing within you as well, right? And that goes along very well with our discussions so far over the last 4 weeks. I've always tried to connect technology to the gods, and I've been avoiding this one because he's a problem, this guy. So let's talk a little bit about Hermes. We've talked about Hephaestus and even Prometheus, and as we should, but Hermes, he's the guy. Why? Well, because he's the god of writing. And we've talked about writing as one of our most profound technologies and how technology restructures consciousness. And so in that vein, Hermes belongs here, as you're going to hear from Eric Davis in a minute. He was an Olympian god of herds and flocks, travelers and hospitality, roads and trade, thievery and cunning, heralds and diplomacy, language and writing, athletic contests and gymnasiums, astronomy and astrology. He was the herald and the personal messenger of Zeus, king of the gods, and also the guide of the dead, who led souls into the underworld. So this is the god of technology because he's the inventor of communication, of writing, in particular that technology. He is a trickster. So many good stories about Hermes right from the beginning. So he was an infant. He was just born, and the first thing he does is steals the cattle of Apollo. That's the first thing he does. He's just out of the womb. So he's born and he steals the cattle of Apollo. And Apollo's a badass. You don't want to mess with Apollo, usually, a sun god, very powerful god. So Hermes takes a turtle and kills it and empties out its shell, and he runs strings across the shell, thereby creating the first lute. And of course, Apollo is the god of the lyre or the lute. So he deceives Apollo as an infant, as a newborn, into getting cattle from him for a turtle shell. All right? And so Zeus liked him so much that he made him one of the 12 supreme gods of Olympus, and of course his messenger. So for example, when Odysseus has washed up onto Calypso's island and decides to stay or is forced to stay, whatever, and Calypso has her mortal human and she's very happy because she kind of hates the other gods. It is Zeus who sends Hermes to Calypso's island to say, you must let the man go, back to his faithful Penelope. We'll talk about him as the god of trade later. He's also a psychopomp. And this is a great word you should inflict on people who don't know. Who's your psychopomp? I see a guy in Beverly Hills. No. A psychopomp is someone who leads someone through the underworld. Very important figure and function in Greek mythology. And this is from Homer's Odyssey. Hermes, the radiant one, that's what he was called, drew near to the gathering of the ghosts of the heroes. So you may remember this in the Odyssey, where he takes Odysseus down into the underworld. This is required of most heroes in the ancient world, whether they're Greek or Roman. You have to go into the underworld. And he sees, or Odysseus sees, Achilles and Agamemnon there, and he moves straight toward them, but only because Hermes has shown him the way to the underworld. He is a psychopomp. It is the word we use as the root of hermeneutics, which is the science or art. It's more of an art of interpretation. And that's because he's the god of language. So again, this is why Hermes is so important to technology, I think, is that the most profound technology we use is communication technology. It changes us. The way we communicate changes us. And I think you could probably open up a browser right now and find an article or 27 that say that very thing about social media. And my point is, it goes all the way back 2500 BCE to writing, which began to restructure our consciousness. He is the god of exchange. And that's because, well, he's also the god of the crossroads. And I know this is going to sound like he's the god of everything. And he's the god of a lot. He's not the god of everything. But this pervasiveness tells you something about Hermes. And I think it's that, there's like Aphrodite, who's the god of love, goddess of love, awesome. There's Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And they do other things, and they have other forms and functions associated with them. But Hermes is like the next layer down. He's like beneath the surface. He's like influencing everything, right? So language, exchange. He's the god of the crossroads, which is, right? We could spend a whole hour talking about the significance of crossroads. And that's also where trade would happen, naturally. He's the god of death. Oh, there's the god of the crossroads. And so I think I see him, as do others, as the god of integration, the god who's not only has a hand in all this stuff, but he's the one who holds it together. Does he hold it together well? No. I mean, I don't know what that would even look like, to hold all these disparate things together well. And so it becomes, instead of a unified field, it becomes a network of nodes. And Hermes is traveling along all these nodes, like a nervous system, or like, I don't know, an internet. This is Eric Davis in his book Technosis, which is in the bookstore, and I highly recommend. By the way, we're going to have Eric around a lot more if you like his work as I do. He writes this: of all the god forms that haunt the Greek mind, Hermes is the one who would feel most at home in our wired world. Indeed, with his mischievous combination of speed, trickery, and profitable mediation, mediation in between, he can almost be seen as the archaic mascot of the information age. Unlike most archetypal figures who lurk in the violent and erotic dream stuff beneath the surface of our everyday awareness, Hermes also embodies the social psychology of language and communication. He flies as fleet as thought. That's one of the appellations given to him. An image of the daylight mind, with its plans and synaptic leaps, its chatter and overload. Hermes shows that these minds are not islands, but nodes in an immense electric tangle of words, images, songs, and signals. All right, let's talk about transcendence. Technology and transcendence tonight, right? What does it mean? You know how I love etymology, because I think it just gives us in just 2 or 3 lines, it gives us a history, the intellectual history of how we've used a word. And so this is from trans and scandere, to climb over, beyond, surmount, or overstep. Well, you know what? We talk about that a lot here at PRS. We talk about how to get beyond ourselves. get beyond the immediate world and its phantoms or realities, to go deeper, to go higher, to get beyond, to surmount or overstep. I also like how these etymologies relate, such as the word survival. Vive, Latin for life, sur, over, to overlive, to live beyond. I want to overlive, don't you? What does this look like in human psychology and culture? Well, transcendence looks like the Imago Dei, for example, the image of God, which comes primarily from the first chapter in Genesis, where God said, let us make man in our own image and in our own likeness. And it's a fundamental feature of Jewish religion and mythology and theology that, like many other things, Jewish Western culture has appropriated for itself, the image of God. Like I said, Genesis 1, like God's knowing good and evil, but we experience transcendence all the time. For example, not the drug. We'll get to the drugs, but not the drug ecstasy. But ecstasy is actually a Greek word that is also used in religious studies. It means quite literally to stand, that's the stase, and ek, to stand out of yourself. Well, that's transcendence, right? I mean, look, to climb over and beyond, just add oneself, and now you're transcendent. And some of this comes across as flow, you know, the great book Flow by the guy whose name I can never pronounce. Mihaly, something. Say it again, Pete. Thank you. Ecstasy and flow. You know this. You've experienced this. If you've given birth, I wish Catherine were here to talk about that. If you've given birth, there's a chance you've, well, really transcended your body in physical ways too. But that sense of being outside of yourself and looking back, it can happen in meditation. It can happen on an athletic field. I've experienced that, not lately, but there are times when you're just shooting the basketball and it's, Michael Jordan used to say, it looks like it's this big and everybody else looks like they're walking. And yeah, I bet it did feel like that for Michael Jordan. Musicians experience this all the time, or not all the time, but they experience it. This sense of getting so lost in the music that you have surmounted yourself. You have transcended yourself. You have stepped over yourself into something else. It's a wonderful thing. Maybe we can talk about it in the discussion. I don't know how we handle that as a culture now. We talk a lot about it in various ways, but I don't know that means we experience it. It might mean we don't experience it, and so we're talking about it. But we'll get into that in the discussion. So what would be the Hermetic tools for transcendence today? Well, they're the same as they've always been, and yet they have new forms. For example, myth. Myth has always been a way of transcending your immediate surroundings, especially when myths are in the process of changing, when one myth is dying and another is rising. But for me, today, I think our most powerful mythology is science fiction in literature and film. It's there that these issues are being worked out philosophically. It's there that these issues are being worked out psychologically and mythologically in science fiction. Very powerful stuff. Magic, we still don't know anything or everything. Maybe we know some things, but we resort to magic when we encounter the unknown. I will tell you in confidence that, as this goes up on YouTube, that there are some strange goings on here at PRS. And I don't want to get too specific, but I'm an educated man. And it took me about 30 seconds to go, what the hell is that? And it must be, and for me to start talking to this thing. All right, Ph.D. Within a minute, I'm ready for the magic, because I don't know what to do with this phenomenon that we're seeing. There is, of course, philosophy, not only in the sense of logic and how to be rational and the art of thinking, but also as a way of putting things together, as a way of supplementing or transcending your thinking into what we would call here wisdom, which is the way to apply these theoretical concepts in your life. There is religion. I wish we could talk about religion at large, as a culture at large. There's so many good ways to talk about religion. That just don't involve you standing within your tradition, what we call in religious studies the emic stance, from inside. So if you stand inside of your tradition and look at somebody else's tradition, yeah, that's not usually going to go anywhere. Unless you're Unitarian, then it goes everywhere, which is awesome. But religion is still a part of our lives. Transcendence, those experiences of transcendence I was talking about, you have to do something with those, right? So when you have those experiences, you have to, first of all, tell yourself a story that will orient you in a world that includes this experience. Whether it's psilocybin or a near-death experience or something like that, or just an amazing gig that you play where you're out of your mind, playing well, you have to account for that. Mythology does that, ritual does that, but the larger term for that is religion, or in Latin, religare. So again, etymologically, religion means that which produces awe or fear. So we could start right there, right? Religion is not what's true. How about if religion is what produces awe or fear in you? Now we're in a whole different conversation, right? And I like the secondary etymology of this term, which is ligament, to tie together. It's the same word for ligament, to tie things together. So you have this experience of awe and fascination. Rudolf Otto called it mysterium tremendum et fascinans, a feeling of tremendous mystery and fascination. Do we have that? Of course we do. You just have to have eyes to see and ears to hear. But after that, you've got to religare that experience. You've got to reconnect that experience and who you are after that experience to where you are now. And that is extremely difficult because you've had this experience and other people haven't had your experience. So the best you can do is say, I had an experience like this. Have you had an experience like this? We should talk about it. And from there, now you're having a religious discussion. And then, of course, there is the science. Science is incredibly important in transcendence, for example. Science is a great via negativa, for example. The negative theology, where you say, is God there? Nope, not there. And for mystics, that's a path. That's a spiritual path to say, not there, because it means you're eliminating possibilities for God. And of course, it's just good to know what is the case. And science is a tool for transcendence in that regard. Yeah. And then there is technology itself, which we've been talking about in this series not as separate, not as nature is to culture, human is to technology. Human beings and technology are wedded from the beginning. They're not separate things. We are technological beings. As soon as we pick up a stick and throw it at somebody else, say, get away from me, you're using technology. As soon as you start a fire and cook over it, you're using technology, not to mention creating brand new things in the world that we're going to get to. All right. What are the technologies of transcendence that we have used historically? Well, this is very interesting if you put these things together, as philosophers and mythographers of technology do. You can see these continua throughout history of how we've used technology. So, for example, there is the Greek gods, who we've talked about a few times. There's Zeus, whose major weapon is what? Thunderbolt, fire, right? There's Hephaestus, who in Roman mythology is called Vulcan. Why? Because he's over a stove. There's Prometheus, who brought fire to humanity. There's Icarus, who we haven't talked about, who flew too close to the sun with his technology and found it very dangerous. There are Taoists, later Taoists in China, who, as human beings do, they get the great teachings of Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, and they decide that what that means is not quality of life so much as quantity of life. And so they become some of the first alchemists, and they end up eating gold because gold, never deteriorates. So if I eat gold, then I won't deteriorate. They even developed a god, I believe it was Sao Chun was his name, called the god of the stove, because the later Taoists were always on the stove cooking something up, Fire, Agni in Hindu mythology is both, is one of the Vedic gods. He's the god of the fire and the acceptor of sacrifices. And so that makes sense, right? I always say that these older cultures, they have their own logic. It's not like they're blind primitives. I hate that word, fumbling around. They have rationality, their own rationality, and their own sense of things. And so it makes certain sense that Agni, the god of fire, would be related to the Vedic gods, because you're offering sacrifices to him. And what takes your sacrifices to the gods but Agni? There are the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus, for example. You remember the pre-Socratics? The story on them is that they're trying to figure out what the substance of the universe is, and that's pretty much right. It's a little limiting, but that's pretty much right. And Heraclitus, for example, the originator of the saying "all things flow," and you cannot step into the same river twice. They're really mystics. I don't know why they're called pre-Socratics. They're mystic philosophers in their own right. He writes this: all things are an interchange for fire, and fire for all things, just like goods for gold and gold for goods. And so if you want to say what the one thing that Heraclitus thought was the essence of the universe, it was fire. Oh, that gets a little tricky because he's a mystic, and you're not sure exactly what he's saying. Empedocles will come along later and talk about four things and four things in motion, and fire is one of those, of course. Many of you will know about alchemy, the alchemical process about transmuting the material world into the spiritual world. It's actually an Arabic word. Manly Hall says this: the fire is not that which survives upon material combustion, but like the ever-burning lamp of the Rosicrucian initiate, this fire endures in a vacuum, ever replenishing itself, and the wick of the lamp is made of salamander's wool, that which we call asbestos. This was the fire of pure love, which never exhausts itself, destroys nothing, but is forever warm and enlightened, providing that tiny flame by which the old adepts read the book of life in the silent hours of the night. Isn't that nice? And of course, related to that is something we use all the time, using it now, Couldn't live without it. Can you imagine if electricity disappeared? We'd be fumbling around in the darkness, trying to figure out how to build a fire with our iPhone. Eric Davis in Technosis says this: electricity would carry 3 different aspects of the alchemical imagination into the modern world. The fascination with the vitality of bodies, and remember this is Galvin and some of the other scientists that influenced Mary Shelley when she wrote Frankenstein. The desire to spiritualize material form, and the millenarian drive to transmute the energies of the earth into a divine realization of human dreams. We'll talk about that in a minute. There is, of course, the atomic bomb, the ultimate fire, perhaps, in terms of the material world. I remember going through White Sands in Trinity Site, where the first test of the atomic bomb was, and then watching a documentary about it where Oppenheimer and Fermi, they're in the bunker at this test of the atomic bomb in New Mexico at Trinity Site, and they're taking bets on what's going to happen. So these are the greatest minds of the world. When is it, 1944 or early 45? And they're taking bets about how much destruction it's going to create. And Enrico Fermi says, I'll bet $100 it incinerates the state of New Mexico. Okay, so it was Oppenheimer who would later quote the Bhagavad Gita, you may know, I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. So you've just created something new in the world. You've unleashed this incredible potential, and what do you do? Where do you go? There's something new in the world. How do you religare? How do you connect it? You go to a story that's 1,500 years old or more. You go to a story, the Bhagavad Gita. And then in more contemporary terms, we have Leslie Marmon Silko, the Laguna Pueblo writer, who writes about, well, she's from Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico, and she writes about the development of the atomic bomb and the use of the atomic bomb as witchery. She calls it the witchery. And isn't it? It's the witchery. It's magic for the sake of destruction. So the atomic bomb. All right, let's get to what you want to talk about. And again, we like to think that we've invented all this, and it actually goes way, way back, including ancient India, with a drug and a god called soma, which Huxley's going to bring into Brave New World in his 1933 novel. I think it's 33. So soma is as a god, and again, it makes sense that these things would be gods, right? It makes perfect sense in that primal rationality, and in our rationality, that this would be considered a god, because it's so much more powerful than you are, and it's messing with you. Well, that's every god I know of, right? Too powerful, unethical, and going to mess with you. So Soma is the god depicted riding a 3-wheeled chariot that's pulled by a team of white horses. If you see that in your next trip, you're welcome. Sometimes he's a bull or a giant rising from the waters, a bird or an embryo, right? How brilliant is that? An embryo, God who's an embryo. And then, of course, he's over a lot of functions of life, such as fortune and health. And then Agni gets involved with him. Let's see here. Agni steals the soma, the drug, and gives it to human beings. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Something wonderful and magical being stolen to be given to human beings. So soma, like all these drugs, was never used cavalierly or even casually by the people who used them. They were used in ritual settings, of course, because it's only 20th century people who would say, hey man, there's a peyote party on the res. Do you want to go? Which actually happened to me. I'm like, no, were you invited? Oh no, we figured we'd just, I'm like, no, because this is I don't know what it was, but I assumed it was in a ritual setting and I would not be invited because I'm not Navajo. But it's interesting in that we know about peyote and ayahuasca, and peyote just in Native American cultures here is really interesting. Again, used in ritual settings, not used casually, although it can be used for healing sometimes. You can make a poultice or something. But what happens is, that's really interesting, I think, is after contact. So what happens with the use of peyote with the coming of Christianity and Western culture to the southwestern tribes, which is in the Sonoran Desert, which is where it was mostly used? Well, it has to go underground, right? You have to do it secretly and in private until 1918, when a group of, I think they were Apache, got to understand American culture and said, you know what? We're a church. We're the Native American church. And part of our communion is peyote. And you know what? They couldn't stop them. And so that became a religious rite for the use of peyote by the Native American church. And you know how that's turned now. So when you hear news of conservatives using religious rites, they kind of stole that back. And so what use do they put it to? They will not bake your cake if you're gay. So that's where they stand on cakes. William James, we've got to mention William James in this discussion because he was writing at the turn of the 20th century, an amazing figure, an amazing contributor to our understanding of transcendence in general, to the form and function of religion in particular. His variety of religious, well, let me just tell you, he was open. His whole thing was, you've got to be open to experience the transcendent, and how obvious is that, right? And so he took nitrous oxide, what was called laughing gas. I don't know if it's still called that. Yeah. Okay, you speak as if you know, my friend. He said, quote, to stimulate the mystical consciousness in himself. And so he was a scientist. Now, he was a rigorous scientist, but he was open. And so he admitted to experience, under this nitrous oxide, he admitted to experiencing, quote, the strongest emotion, unquote, that he'd ever felt. And based on that experience, he says, we slip into an altered state of consciousness, different from our ordinary waking or rational consciousness. And he wrote this: no account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. This is one of the things, by the way, I love about being here, is I'm an academic. Manly Hall hated people like me. He didn't really hate anybody, but he was afraid that the academics would take over PRS. And his point was well taken. They wouldn't let us talk about this. You would be laughed out of the room if you tried to talk about this at the American Academy of Religion, for example, or at a philosophy conference. It was not open. And so I'm happy to be able to be here and talk about these things, to widen my own lens, as William James did, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience. What a perfect title. There is, of course, the 60s, which I guess we usually associate with this. And from our friend Aldous Huxley, who was friends with Manly Hall, You know the work, I think it's 1952, The Doors of Perception. He writes this. He called it the door in the wall. When you took mescaline or psilocybin or whatever, you went through the door in the wall. He writes this: the person who comes back through the door in the wall will never be quite the same as the person who went out. He will be wiser, but less sure, happier, but less satisfied, humbler in acknowledging his ignorance, yet better equipped to understand the relationship of words to things, of systematic reasoning to the unfathomable mystery which it tries forever vainly to comprehend. There it is. Beautiful. Terence McKenna, who with his brother Dennis, yes, went tromping around the Amazon to watch what they called vegetable television. I love this guy. He writes this: it is the sheer power of the hallucinogens that puts people off. You either love them or hate them, and that's because they dissolve worldviews. If you like the experience of having your entire ontological structure disappear out from under you, you'll probably love psychedelics. And then there's Timothy Leary, of course. Psychedelic drugs cause panic and temporary insanity in people who have not taken them. And then you probably know Michael Pollan most recent book is about this experience, which as a good journalist, he underwent himself with a guide. And he writes this, and I agree with this completely. The usual antonym for the word spiritual is material. I think that's old thinking. Well, he says, that at least is what I believed when I began this inquiry, that the whole issue of spirituality turned on a question of metaphysics. Now I'm inclined to think a much better and certainly more useful antonym for spiritual might be egotistical. And this is from How You Change Your Mind, what the new science of psychedelics teaches us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, and transcendence. All right, space exploration gives me a chance to refer to my favorite myth, again, the Popol Vuh. Again, the point here is I don't want you to think this is new. It's actually ancient space exploration. So this is the early on in the Popol Vuh, the Mayan Council Book, it's called. And well, let me read this and I'll tell you more about it. This part is the creation story. It takes a long performance and account to complete the lighting of all the sky earth. They called it, the Mayan word is sky earth, so there's no separation. The fourfold sighting, the fourfold cornering, measuring, the fourfold staking, having, making half of the cord, stretching the cord in the sky, on the earth, on the four sides, the four corners, as it is said by the maker, modeler, the mother father, again, no separation, mother father of life, of humankind, giver of breath, giver of heart, bearer, upbringer in the light that lasts of those born in the light, begotten in the light, warrior, knower of everything, whatever there is, sky, earth, lake, sea. And love this line, self-referential, as much of the Popol Vuh is. This is the account. Here it is. Now it still ripples. Now it still murmurs, ripples. It sighs. It still hums. And it is empty under the sky. How shall it be sown, and how shall it dawn? So we read this, and we read, myths, and okay, there's a figure called Crocodile, and there's a group of boys called the 100 Boys, and you're like, okay, these people were tripping, right? Which maybe they were, but this is all so practical. The Popol Vuh, while being this fantastic account of creation, is actually an almanac. How shall it be sown into the earth? How shall it dawn, rising up out of the earth? These are stories of the constellations. So the 100 boys are the Pleiades. The crocodile is, I forget what constellation he is, but these are constellations moving across the sky during the year. And as you know, they had very interesting calendrical, they had like 4 calendars, calendrical imagination, and how they all interlocked. And somehow we survived 2012, but they still use these calendars in incredibly accurate ways. And what they're doing is they're telling a great story that also happens to correspond with the movement of the stars in the sky, which will tell you when to plant corn and when it will dawn. So again, no separation. So you plant something in the ground, but it comes up in the sky. How shall it dawn? Beautiful. I could go on and on. Our imagination of heaven is space exploration. Now, I'll show you this more clearly in a minute. We have sky charts from China from 2300 BCE, over 4,000 years ago. Sky charts. And you know that astrology was important to the ancient Babylonians, right up into the current Californians. Astronomy develops out of that. Who knows who Werner Magnus Maximilian Ferrer von Braun is? Yes, exactly. I didn't realize that was his whole name, but how awesome is that? Werner Magnus Maximilian Ferrer von Braun.
That's why he's a von Braun, because of the ability.
Yeah, okay. Well, he was an interesting cat. He was a German scientist, developer of rockets, who became an evangelical Christian. And that's why he came to America, is he didn't think the Germans should have this rocket technology. He thought it should be people who believed in God.
I thought the government paid him money, and he was also like...
Well, yeah, they paid him.
From the Americans were getting enslaved by the Soviets.
Yeah, that's part of it too. I mean, he's in a tricky position, right, in Germany at that time. He wrote this. So this is a guy who's the best in the world at putting things up into space. And he writes this: if humanity is Alpha and Omega, then it is profoundly important for religious reasons that humanity travel to other worlds, other galaxies. For it may be human beings' destiny to assure immortality, and not only of our race, but even of the spark of life itself. That's a German rocket scientist. By the grace of God, we shall in this century successfully send a person through space to the moon and to other planets on the first leg of our last and greatest journey. I love that. And of course, Joseph Campbell's, I think this was his last work, The Inner Reaches of Outer Space, was so excited by the moon landing and the Apollo missions. He really thought, and I would have thought this too, he really thought that with this new discovery, this new understanding of our world, that our mythologies would change. He wrote this: as viewed by astronauts from the moon, the Earth lacks those lines of socio-political division that are so prominent on maps. And as recognized here below, the web of interlacing socio-economic dependencies that now enfolds the planet is of one life. And all that is required is a general change of vision to accord with these contemporary facts. And that this will occur is certain. It is, in fact, already occurring. Moreover, the vision required is nothing new nor unnatural. What are unnatural, artificial, and contrived are the separations between us. A wonderful vision, a wonderful idea. that was dampened, at the very least, if not drowned, by whatever you want to call it. Our cynicism, our lack of openness. I remember talking with some professors when we found water on Mars, and one of them was like, this is going to be the Aretian revolution from Ares, Mars. And yeah, all right, we kept tweeting and didn't really notice. Again, there's a continuity of all these technologies of transcendence. So selective breeding or artificial selection as opposed to natural selection, right? That was noticed by Darwin. And of course, practiced by every farming community in the world, right? Selective breeding. We figured this out a while ago. Choosing the organisms with the most desired traits and mating them with the intention of combining and propagating these traits. This is obvious, and yet it is a technology. We did the same with plants, especially wheat and corn. We wouldn't be here if we hadn't figured out how to grow wheat and corn. It has been a staple of human existence for thousands and thousands of years. There's also the dog, which is, yes, the dog is technology, sure, and genetic engineering. It was 32,000 years ago, I'm told, that wild wolves in East Asia joined groups of humans as scavengers, right? Because we were scavengers too. And then in time, they kept hanging around, and we kept petting them and feeding them. And now they're our weird little dogs that we carry around, or sometimes they carry us around. There is, of course, the Human Genome Project completed in April 2003, which created some shocking symmetries because, again, I didn't know this history, but I found it really interesting in the research. So apparently before the human genome was mapped, scientists were thinking that the difference between us and apes, chimpanzees, et cetera, must be massive. There must be massive amounts of difference between our DNA and theirs. And you probably know this now. It's one of those facts that's become like a thing that everybody says, not everybody, but people use. There's only 2% difference between us and a chimpanzee, which is true. That's the 2% difference. That's the shocking simplicity of it. Who am I quoting? Oh, Robert Sapolsky. I don't know if you know this guy. He's a Stanford biologist who's a great teacher on YouTube. That's the 2% solution. And that's the shocking simplicity of it. Humans, to be human, and that is the title of our series, Being Human, don't need to have evolved unique genes that code for entirely novel types of neurons or neurotransmitters, or a more complex hippocampus with resultant improvements in memory, or a more complex frontal cortex. Instead, he writes, our braininess as a species arises from having humongous numbers of just a few types, not many different types, but just a few types of off-the-rack neurons. That's where I get my neurons, off the rack. And from the exponentially greater number of interactions with them, right? So it's not quantity, it's the interactions. It's the network, it's Hermes in your brain. Okay. Qualitative distinctions, he writes, emerge from large numbers. So it's not the numbers, it's the interactions of these small differences. All right. And then we're now at the point, we talked about this last time or time before, or both. Consciousness recreating nature. Who knows what the clustered, regularly interspaced, short palindromic repeats is? CRISPR, Satinder, yes, CRISPR, which is a gene editing technology. So, gene editing, technology. Again, we've done this in our ways before, gotten what we wanted to make ourselves, to improve or save ourselves. I remember being in my doctoral program in the 90s, and transplantation had become pretty routine. And so there's a family who had a daughter who needed an organ, and it was rare blood type, whatever. So they had another kid and harvested the organ to save the first kid. Genetic engineering. I remember a professor of biology at one of my schools, and he gave this great lecture. It's one of the best lectures I've ever heard on evolution. And then we would meet afterwards as a faculty and kind of talk about it so that we could take back to our classes what the insights from the lecture. It was a beautiful lecture. And I said, Professor, you've shown us the tree of evolution in a compelling, even beautiful way. Where is consciousness on that tree? And he said, I don't understand. I said, okay, we're conscious, right? That is a feature of being human and of human beings. Yes. Can you point to consciousness on that tree? I don't understand what you're talking about. And, it is a bit an unfair question, but on the other hand, it's extremely fair, right? And it's because even though he had this beautiful lecture on evolution, he was still trapped in the material, empirical worldview of science. And he could not put consciousness on the tree, which is pretty interesting because consciousness created the tree. Hermes, right? So now, this consciousness is growing a new tree. It's creating an entirely new tree through this gene editing technology. All right, we got to talk about artificial intelligence. There's some artificial intelligence produced art. Take it as you will. Ancient Greece, we've talked about this, Pygmalion and Galatea. Talos, the great mechanical automaton that patrolled the island of Crete. There's Golem, that you may know, that a clay creature created by Jews, rabbis in the ghetto in the Middle Ages, that was magically brought to life to just protect them. Survival is transcendence too, right? To overlive, to live past your immediate circumstances. And the word golem in Hebrew means something like embryo, something inchoate, incomplete, unfinished. God. All right, let's just get this out here. Our favorite form of artificial intelligence is God. We make these gods, and they don't make us. If we recognize that, that will help us transcend some of our limitations when it comes to religion. If you understand that we make these gods, I don't care if you're in ancient Greece or China or Mesopotamia, these gods, do you ever wonder why gods look so much like you and act so much like you? Is it because you made them? We made them. And so the Imago Dei is actually reversed. And Ludwig Feuerbach, the great Christian anthropologist, said, theology is anthropology, right? So I want you to consider at least the possibility that gods are artificial intelligence, and we've been making them for a long time. There is, of course, Alan Turing, the great British scientist, who the inaugurator of artificial intelligence as we understand it in a computer now, who thought that what you had to do to create intelligence was imitate human behavior. So I think there's actually a film about Turing called The Imitation Game, right? That was the whole point. And he said, he created, you may know, the Turing test, which is basically you put someone in one room and then You put a machine and a human being in another room, and you have the person, the first person just ask questions of the human and of the machine. And if you can't tell the difference, then that is artificial intelligence. That's the Turing test. And that's Blade Runner, right? My favorite part of Blade Runner is when Rachel asks him, have you taken the test? Exactly. Have you taken the test, Deckard? Are you a replicant? What's the difference? And of course, what comes next is the transcendence game, because Turing wasn't satisfied with just that. And no computer programmer is that I've read about. You don't want repetition, you don't want imitation, or you do want it, but you don't want to stop there. What you want is transcendence. You want the machine to learn itself. And that's where we get Terminator. Machine learning and consciousness. Still looking like a human being, sounding like a human being, behaving like a human being, but learning in a very different way than a human being. And even in contemporary life, with these people, wherever they are, probably Silicon Valley, creating these AIs. Let me read you, this is Tom Furness from the Human Interface Technology Laboratory, which sounds creepy. He writes this: on the other side of our data gloves, we become creatures of colored light in motion, pulsing with golden particles. We will all become angels for eternity. Cyberspace will feel like paradise, a space for collective restoration of the habit of perfection. This is, let's see. Oh, I think this is, oh, it's right. This is Michael Heim, a philosopher. Our fascination with computers is more deeply spiritual than utilitarian. It's utilitarian, to be sure, but it's also spiritual. He says, when online, we break free from bodily existence, and there it is, isn't it? We want to shuffle off this mortal coil, but keep reading Twitter and Facebook. We don't want to give up life, we just want to give up this body. From our earthly existence, and emulate, this is really smart what he did, the Visio Dei, not the Imago Dei, but the Visio Dei, the perspective of God, the all-at-onceness of divine knowledge. See, they talk like this.
So ego.
Pretty big ego. We are as gods, and we might as well get good at it. This scares the shit out of me. The seeker in the digital age. That's after the colon of tonight's lecture. What does it mean to be a seeker? A seeker of transcendence in the digital age. We have at our fingertips, quite literally at our fingertips, more knowledge than any other human on the planet. In fact, we've generated more knowledge as a generation than any other generation on the planet. Knowledge is exploding, has been exploding in the last 100 years at an exponential rate. And that's why specialists become smaller and smaller and smaller, because there's so much, and so you have to keep, if you want to write a dissertation, you've got to get it really narrow into something you can manage. Or you zoom out and try to catch the big picture, which is what I like doing. But knowledge helps us. It is not the end. It is a means to an end, and it's good to have. And we have it more than anyone else has. We have new technologies of communication. You're here tonight, but this week this will go up on YouTube because Liz remembered to turn on the camera, why I usually forget. And we have 7,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel. I'm not sure what all that means, but if we have half that watching this video, that's amazing. That's a good thing, right? McLuhan talked about technology as the expansion of our senses. And so my voice and your voice can go out across the globe. That's a good thing. Of course, there's a Faustian exchange with all this, but let's not forget the good part of the Faustian exchange. Mind expansion, quite literally. Through drugs, through new products and processes of the imagination. It's the best time to be a seeker, I think, probably since Alexandria had the library. It's the best time to be a seeker. We have tremendous technology, and especially the opportunities to transcend our ego, which is why I think many of us seekers are so disappointed in social media and how it's being used, because this is an incredible opportunity to transcend your ego. And I don't know about you, but I feel like it's a spiritual thing when I read big data analyses. Now, I'm very critical and suspicious of big data analyses, but if even some of it's true, I don't get to say some of the bullshit I say, because there's the data. Or I don't get to think that about myself, because you know what? My app says I did not work out as much as I thought I did. In fact, I sat around. So my watch told me, and this can be a really good thing. It can cut through the lies you tell yourself. And again, there are other sides to this, but I want us to remember that it's a good time to be a seeker and to seek transcendence in this world. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Happy to talk about all this. It's going to be good discussion, I think. Yeah.